I've never believed in ghost stories, much less demons. My name is Nathan Carter, and I'm a skeptic by nature. I grew up hearing tales of witches and hauntings in Salem, Massachusetts, the town that has become synonymous with hysteria and death. I always assumed they were just stories to attract tourists. When my wife Lila and I bought our first house in Salem, we knew it had a storied past. It was a 17th century building with crooked walls and an attic full of cobwebs. But the price was irresistible, and the realtor assured us that everything was in perfect condition. The one detail he didn't mention was the basement, not because it was broken or dilapidated, but because no one wanted to talk about it. Our move-in went smoothly at first. The neighborhood was nice, the neighbors were friendly, and the house seemed to have its own personality. But there was something strange. The basement was locked with old, rusty padlocks, and there was no sign of a key. At first, we thought it was a mistake. Maybe the previous owner had forgotten to give us the keys. I called him, but got no answer, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. One night, I went down to the basement with a pair of bolt cutters and started cutting through the locks. The sound of the metal creaking seemed to echo through the house in a way it shouldn't. Lila stood in the doorway, holding a flashlight and eyeing me nervously. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked. "It's just a basement, Lila. It probably has old tools or boxes of junk." As the last lock fell off, a horrible smell of mold and something else, something metallic like blood, filled the air. Lila stepped back, covering her nose with her hand. I slowly opened the door and a wave of cold air hit me, as if we were entering an ancient cave. Lila's flashlight illuminated the narrow wooden steps that led down into darkness. Something in the background seemed to glow faintly, like recently extinguished candles. "Must be a crack in the floor," I muttered, trying to ignore the shiver that ran down my spine. We made our way down the steps carefully, and the flashlight revealed what appeared to be an empty space. But as we moved forward, the room began to take shape. The floor was stone, marked with carved symbols I didn't recognize. The walls were covered in fingernail marks, as if someone had tried to get out of there. In the center of the basement was a circle drawn on the floor, with candles arranged around it. They were unlit, but the air seemed to vibrate as if an invisible energy was still trapped there. "Nathan, this isn't right," Lila said, her voice shaking. I bent down to examine the circle, but before I could touch it, I heard a low, guttural sound coming from somewhere in the darkness. "Who's there?" I asked, but my voice echoed back to me, distorted. Lila tugged at my arm. "Let's get out of here now." As we hurried up, the basement door slammed shut, trapping us in darkness. Lila screamed, and the flashlight fell to the floor, shattering. We were left in total darkness, the metallic smell now unbearable. I heard slow, heavy footsteps echoing around us. They weren't ours. "Nathan," Lila whispered, her voice thick with dread. A red light began to glow in the circle in the center of the basement, as if lit by something invisible. The marks on the floor began to glow as well, and a tall, skeletal figure emerged from the darkness, its eyes glowing like embers. "You opened the door," said a deep voice that seemed to come from inside our heads, "and now you can't close it." The thing took a step forward, and I felt my body freeze. Lila was crying, but she couldn't move. The air felt too heavy to breathe. "What do you want?" I managed to mumble. The figure laughed, a sound that reverberated through the basement and caused the candles to spontaneously light. "I want freedom. I want the world, and you have brought me the first offer." The tall, skeletal figure watched us from the center of the circle, its eyes glowing like embers, lighting up the darkness. The air around us vibrated with an energy that seemed to erode our sanity. Lila sobbed beside me, but I knew running wasn't an option. The door was shut, and the presence before us wouldn't let us escape. "You set me free," the entity said, its voice echoing through the basement, "but the sacrifice is yet to be made." My heart froze. Sacrifice. The word weighed like lead in my ears. "Please, we didn't mean to do anything," I shouted. "We'll close the door, we'll leave. You'll never see us again." The creature tilted its head as if considering my words. Then it took a step toward Lila. "A trade must be made. You open the door. Now one of you must stay so it remains open." Lila screamed, trying to back away, but her body seemed frozen in place. I couldn't leave her there. "Take me," I said desperately. "Let her go." The figure laughed, a deep laugh that made the basement walls tremble. "This doesn't depend on you, human. She's already been chosen." The marks on the floor began to glow even more intensely, and the circle of candles blazed with red flames. A thick black smoke started rising from the ground, enveloping Lila. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. Without thinking, I ran toward her, trying to pull her out of the circle. But the moment I crossed the glowing line, an intense pain shot through my body, as if I were being burned from the inside out. "You can't interfere," the voice echoed again. "This is the will of the blood spilled here centuries ago. The door will open completely and the world will see my glory." Suddenly, I heard a loud bang on the basement door. It was like an electric shock cutting through the oppressive silence. "Nathan, Lila, are you there?" I recognized the voice. It was Father Donovan, a man we'd recently met at the local church. We'd talked to him about the history of the house, and he'd warned us not to mess with the basement. I hadn't taken him seriously, but now his words came back to me with terrible weight. "We're down here," I shouted with all my might. "Please, help." The door burst open with a bang, and the priest ran down the stairs holding a crucifix and a Bible. As soon as he entered, the creature let out a deafening roar, retreating to the center of the circle. "You do not belong to this world, spirit," Donovan shouted, raising the crucifix. "Return to the darkness from which you came." The priest began reciting words in Latin, and the creature howled in fury. The basement floor began to crack, revealing an abyss below, from which an intense red light emanated. The air grew heavier, and I could barely breathe. Lila, now free from the circle, collapsed to the ground, coughing and sobbing. I ran to her and pulled her back while Donovan continued the exorcism. "Don't leave the basement yet," he ordered. "If you cross the door now, the ritual won't be complete. Close your eyes and don't open them until I say." We obeyed, holding on to each other while the priest faced the demon. The sounds of the battle seemed to fill every corner of the basement. Screams, prayers, and the sound of something breaking like glass. Finally, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the basement was dark again, and the circle on the floor had disappeared. The priest was kneeling on the ground, exhausted, but alive. "It's done," he said, his voice weak. "But never come back here. This house still carries the mark of evil. It won't stay safe for long." Lila and I climbed the stairs, leaving the basement locked forever. But something didn't feel right. As we left the house, I looked back and saw a shadow in the reflection of the basement window. It was watching us, its eyes faintly glowing in the dark. We never returned to that house, but sometimes at night, I still hear the voice of the demon whispering in my dreams. "I'll be back, Nathan." The door never fully closes. I knew that New Orleans had a rich and mysterious history, but I never imagined that something could involve me so directly. My name is Lisa Morgan, and I am a visual arts student. I've always loved exploring old and peculiar places, and this city seemed like a paradise for someone as curious as I am. But that curiosity almost destroyed me. It all began on a Saturday afternoon. I was walking through the French Quarter, enjoying my free time exploring antique shops. That's when I found a small store tucked away in a narrow alley. The rusted sign at the entrance read, "Madame Clara's Treasures." Something drew me inside. The store was an organized chaos. Shelves filled with dusty books, boxes of old jewelry, and African masks hanging on the walls. There was the smell of burning incense and something else metallic, almost like rust. That's when I saw it. A doll sitting on a shelf in the back of the shop. It was different from anything I had ever seen. Small, made of dark wood, and wearing a delicate lace dress that seemed to be centuries old. Its glass eyes were so lifelike that, for a moment, I had the feeling it was watching me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice startled me. I turned around and saw an elderly woman, probably Madame Clara, with penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Yes, it's unique," I replied, trying to sound confident. Madame Clara gave a small smile, but her eyes grew serious. "This doll is not an ordinary object. It belonged to Eloise Devereaux, a practitioner of voodoo. Many say she cursed this doll, using it as a vessel to store part of her soul." I laughed, thinking she was just trying to make the story more interesting to sell the item. "Well, stories like that are what make things more valuable, right?" Madame Clara's smile faded. "This is not a story, girl. It's a warning. If you take this doll, you must understand that it carries something dark." Still, I bought it. Maybe it was the fascination with the story, maybe it was the challenge. But deep down, I knew I should have listened to the warning. That night I placed the doll on a shelf in my room. With its presence, the room seemed to gain a strange weight. The air felt denser, more stifling, but I ignored it. It started slowly. First, there were the noises, the sound of light footsteps on the wooden floor during the night, even when I was alone. Then, things started to move. A chair I had left in the corner of the room was turned when I returned from the kitchen. My keys appeared in the bathroom, even though I was sure I had left them on the table. And then came the dreams. I dreamed of a woman I had never seen before. She was tall, with long hair and pale skin that glowed in the candlelight. In every dream, she was on an altar, surrounded by strange symbols, holding the doll. Her lips moved, but her words were whispered in a language I didn't understand. On the last night, the dream was different. The woman looked directly at me and clearly said, "You opened the door. Now, you cannot close it." I woke up in a panic, drenched in cold sweat. The room was dark, but I knew something was wrong. When I looked at the foot of the bed, my heart stopped. The doll, which had been on the shelf, was now sitting there, leaning forward as if it were watching me. I screamed and turned on the light, but the doll didn't move. I grabbed it and threw it in a box, locking it in a cupboard. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights on. The next morning, I decided to get rid of it. I took the box and threw it in a trash can on the corner. But when I came back home, there it was, sitting on the shelf again, as if it had never left. That's when I realized I couldn't handle this on my own. I needed help before it was too late. I knew I needed help. After the doll came back to my shelf on its own, there was no ignoring what was happening anymore. I grabbed my phone and searched for Madame Clara's number, the owner of the store where I bought it. "I warned you not to take it," Madame Clara said, her voice heavy with concern as I explained the situation. "You freed Eloise Devereaux. Now she's trapped between worlds, trying to use you as a portal to return fully." "How can I get rid of her?" I asked, desperation overflowing in my voice. There was a pause. "It won't be easy, but if you have enough courage, you can face Eloise and seal her soul back into the doll." She instructed me to come to her shop that night. Hesitant, I went. The store seemed even more oppressive at night, with shadows dancing on the walls and the smell of incense stronger than ever. Madame Clara prepared everything in a room at the back. There were candles lit around a circle drawn on the floor with white chalk. The center of the circle was reserved for the doll, which I brought in a bag. As soon as I placed it there, the air in the room seemed to change. "The ritual will require your strength and courage," Clara said. "You need to face Eloise. She'll try to manipulate you, but you cannot give in. If you manage to seal her back, the curse will be broken. If not..." She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what it meant. The ritual began with Clara reciting words in a language I didn't understand. The air grew heavier, and the candles began to flicker, as if an invisible wind passed through the room. The smell of something burning filled the space, and I felt something cold touch my skin, like invisible hands. Suddenly, the lights went out, leaving only the dim glow of the candles. When I looked at the doll, I saw something horrifying. It wasn't still anymore. Its hands moved slowly, and its glass eyes glowed with an ominous light. A low laugh echoed through the room, and then Eloise appeared. Eloise's figure materialized in the center of the circle. She was tall, with long black hair that floated as if submerged in water. Her eyes were completely black, and her smile revealed teeth as sharp as blades. "You were foolish to bring me here," she said, her voice booming like thunder. "Now, there's no turning back." She stepped forward, but the chalk circle seemed to hold her back. Still, I felt her presence invade my mind. Nightmarish visions flooded my mind, images of death, destruction, and bloody rituals performed by Eloise in the past. "I can free you from this torment," she whispered, her voice sweet and deceiving. "All you have to do is let me go." My head was pounding, but I remembered Clara's words. "Don't give in." "You won't deceive me," I shouted, facing the fear. Eloise laughed again, but her expression changed. Now she looked enraged, and the room began to tremble. The candles went out, and darkness took over. With Clara's guidance, I began reciting the words of the ritual she had taught me. My voice trembled, but I kept going. Eloise screamed, her figure writhing like smoke trying to escape. "You can't defeat me. I am eternal." But the words seemed to work. The doll began to vibrate, and Eloise was slowly sucked back into it. Her figure grew smaller and smaller until only the doll remained, motionless in the center of the circle. Clara quickly placed the doll in a wooden box decorated with protective symbols and locked it with an iron key. "It's done," she said, but her voice carried a tone of warning. "Eloise is sealed again, but her presence will never be completely erased. You must leave New Orleans and never look back." I obeyed without hesitation. I left the city the next day, abandoning everything. For a while I thought I was free, but months later I received a package with no return address. Inside, I found a piece of the doll's dress and a note with a single sentence, "I'll be back." I had no idea what awaited us that night. My name is Eric Thompson, and my idea was simple: film a documentary about St. Mary's Hospital, a place that everyone in Baltimore avoided. It was an old, abandoned building surrounded by stories of missing patients and hauntings. To me, it was the perfect setting for a horror project. I was wrong. My friends Mia, Dylan, and Sophia agreed to join. Mia was my recording partner, always ready for any adventure. Dylan, ever the skeptic, was only there to laugh at our paranoias. And Sophia, well, Sophia was different. She seemed to hesitate, as if she knew what was about to happen. We arrived at the hospital at midnight. The building was imposing, its broken windows reflecting the moonlight. The air was cold, and the wind carried a smell of mold and rusted metal. The exterior walls were covered with graffiti, but some words seemed recent. "Do not enter." "Perfect," Dylan said, holding a flashlight. "What a cliché of a place." Mia laughed, but Sophia stayed silent, staring at the entrance. "Something's wrong here," she murmured. "The place feels alive." I ignored the comment and pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, as if the hospital was warning us to stay out. We entered, and the darkness swallowed us. The main hallway was dusty, with papers scattered on the floor. Medical files, old charts, and even broken medication bottles filled the air with a sense of abandonment and chaos. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it at the walls. They were covered in dark stains that looked like dried blood. The marks weren't random. They formed strange symbols drawn with eerie precision. "Someone's had too much free time," Dylan joked, but even he seemed uneasy. "These symbols, they look like rituals," Sophia said, gently touching one of them. We continued walking, Mia's camera recording every detail. We reached a room that seemed to have been used for surgeries. In the center, there was a rusted table, covered by a dark, stained sheet. "Bet there's a mannequin under this," Dylan said, laughing. Mia pulled off the sheet, but there was nothing there. At least nothing we could see. Still, I swear I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, like a shadow slipping through the door. "Did anyone see that?" I asked, but everyone shook their heads. As we explored, the sounds began. At first it was soft footsteps, like someone walking barefoot upstairs. Then came low whispers, barely audible, coming from every direction. Sophia stopped suddenly. "Eric, I feel something," she said, looking into the room beside us. Something's watching us. Dylan rolled his eyes. You've been watching too many horror movies, Sophia. But I knew she wasn't imagining it. The air in the hospital felt different, heavy, as if something invisible was pressing down on us. We came to an old medical filing room. Piles of files were scattered on the floor, some with faded photographs of patients. One of the names caught my attention. Harlan Finch. Isn't he the doctor who did those experiments? I asked. Sophia nodded, her voice quiet. He did experimental lobotomies. They say he believed he could cure sick souls, but ended up destroying people. No one knows how many died here because of him. One file had a red X marked on it. When I opened it, I felt a chill. It was the record of a patient, but the last note simply said, "Transferred to final surgery." "This is sick," Mia said, turning off the camera for a moment. "This place should be demolished." Suddenly, we heard a loud noise. Something fell at the end of the hallway. We rushed to see and found a gurney that had been pushed into the middle of the path. "The wind must have done that," Dylan said, but his voice trembled slightly. Sophia looked at us with wide eyes. "It's not the wind. He's here." We tried to leave, but the door we came through was locked. When I looked at Mia, something froze my blood. On her camera's viewfinder, a figure was reflected in the window behind us. It was a tall man, wearing a lab coat with his face covered by a blood-stained surgical mask. "Run!" I screamed, and we started running down the hall, but the sound of footsteps behind us grew louder, closer. When I looked back, I saw the lights flickering, and the man vanished into the darkness. We knew we weren't alone, and whatever was with us wanted us to stay forever. The sound of footsteps wouldn't stop. They echoed through the hospital's hallways, growing louder with every second. We knew something was chasing us, but every time we looked back, we only saw shadows dancing in the darkness. "Eric, what do we do?" Mia asked, breathless, her camera trembling in her hands. I had no answers. All we knew was that we were trapped in there, with a presence that seemed to be enjoying hunting us down. Sophia stopped suddenly and grabbed my arm. "Over here," she said, pointing to a slightly open door. It was an operating room. We ran inside, but as soon as we closed the door, we heard a low, almost inhuman laugh echoing down the hallway. The room was submerged in dim light, with an emergency light flickering in the corner. There were rusted gurneys, surgical tables covered by sheets, and tools that seemed untouched since the day the hospital shut down. In the center of the room, an operating table seemed to beckon us, with handprints imprinted on the metal covered in rust and something that looked like dried blood. "This place is worse than I imagined," I muttered, trying to keep calm. Dylan laughed nervously. "It's just an old hospital, guys. We'll get out of here." But when he said that, we heard a click. The door behind us had locked by itself. The sound of metal instruments hitting the floor echoed as if someone had knocked them down. We all froze, looking at the source of the noise. On the operating table, something began to move under the sheet. Mia took a step back. "It can't be. There's no one here." When the sheet slipped, we saw a humanoid figure, twisted, covered in scars and stitch marks. Its eyes were sewn shut, but it still seemed to be looking at us. The creature got up, moving in disjointed motions, and pointed at Sophia. "The surgery is scheduled," it said, in a hoarse, terrifying voice, which seemed to come from deep within the room. We turned to face the voice, and there he was, Dr. Harlan Finch. Finch's figure was a living nightmare. He wore a blood-stained lab coat, and a surgical mask covered part of his disfigured face. He held a rusty saw in one hand and a pair of forceps in the other. "You came to my hospital," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. "And now, you will meet the final cure." The entire room began to shake. The lights flickered violently and whispers filled the air, as if the hospital's walls were speaking. Sophia screamed as Finch slowly advanced toward her. I tried to hold her back, but something shoved me away. An invisible force that seemed to want to separate us. "He's choosing her," Mia screamed, trying to pull Sophia back. I knew we had to do something. In the chaos, I noticed a cabinet on the side of the room, with glass jars filled with dark liquid. I grabbed one of the jars, breaking it on the floor. The smell was unbearable, like rotting flesh. Dr. Finch stopped, staring directly at me. "That belongs to them," he said, pointing to the jars. "You shouldn't touch what you don't understand." Then I realized those jars contained remains of the patients he had operated on. Blood, perhaps pieces of organs, something that still tied their spirits to the hospital. "If I destroy this, they'll be freed," I thought, gathering my courage. As Finch advanced toward me, I knocked all the jars to the floor. The liquid spilled, and screams echoed in the room, screams that weren't ours. They were the spirits of the patients, finally freed. Finch's figure began to writhe, as if being torn apart from the inside out. He tried to advance, but shadows began pulling him into the floor. "This isn't over!" he screamed, before vanishing completely. The room fell silent except for the sound of our heavy breathing. The door unlocked on its own, and we ran out of the hospital. As we stepped outside, the sun was beginning to rise. The fresh air had never felt so good, but none of us spoke a word. We were marked by that night. Later, when reviewing the footage, we saw something that made our blood freeze again. In the last scene filmed by Mia's camera before she turned it off, Dr. Finch appears, standing in the darkness, staring directly at us with a sinister smile. We never returned to St. Mary's Hospital, but sometimes, on nights of absolute silence, I still hear the sound of a surgical saw coming from somewhere far away.